Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community. Welcome, listeners, to another Mailbag episode of Beyond the B. I'm your host, Emmy Allison, and I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Honeyman.
Hey, Emmy.
Today, we're responding to a few listener questions about the new B Corp standards, talking about the latest that we know, answering your questions about how to prepare for them ahead of their impending release. But first, Ryan's going to share some stats about the podcast thus far in true Mailbag fashion.
Yeah, thanks, Emmy. One of the things we've done in past episodes, since we have tried to make this a little more engaging of a podcast and responsive to listeners, is to give some of our stats about what people are saying, where folks are calling in from, how many people are listening, etc. So we have, to date, released 18 episodes, and our total downloads to date are 5,500 listens. So that's an average of about 300 listeners per episode, and that puts us in the top 25% of all podcasts on the market.
All podcasts of all time?
Yeah.
That's pretty exciting.
There's a lot of bad podcasts out there. And the top countries where people are tuning in from is first the US. We have about half of the listeners coming in from the US. Second, we have the United Kingdom. Third, we have Canada. Fourth, we have Japan. Shout out to Nozomi and the team in Japan. They're big listeners and supporters of this podcast. We also have the Netherlands coming in at fifth, and then Germany. And then we have a tie between Denmark, Spain, Australia, and Sweden. And so quite a global crew of listeners. And so thanks everyone for tuning in. And the last thing I'll say is our most popular episodes of all time continue to be Arench Sahan's episode on struggle for the soul of the B Corp movement. As a reminder, I think that was episode number 4. Yeah, so number 4, almost pretty soon after we started, was really looking at, is B Corp doing enough? Are we making enough of an impact? And the results of companies like Nespresso and others joining the B Corp movement. Arench is from Donut Economics. And so that was a great episode. Encourage folks to check that out. The second most listened to is Intro to Beyond the B. So the first episode of this podcast, people are like, who are these people? And what is it? So that's our number 2. And then third place is with Clay Brown on episode 8 from September of 2024 about the latest updates on the new B Corp standards. And so we will be talking about the B Corp standards today. And I will just say that there's a bit of a joke that we have on the Lyft team, is that if you have Patagonia on a podcast episode, it will immediately become one of the top 10 most listened to episodes. So we have another podcast, which if folks don't subscribe to, you should check it out. It's called Next Economy Now, and it's more broad than the B Corp movement. It's interviewing leaders who are creating the next economy. And we've had, I think, 6 or 7 people from Patagonia on that show over the last, 8 years. And those 7 episodes are in the top 10 of all episodes of all time. And so it's a long way of saying Vincent Stanley, we just had an interview with Vincent, and it's already the fastest, most listens in 7 days of any episode. So it's inevitably, I think this episode with Patagonia will be our most listened to, but it's just not yet. And so that's some stats for you. And maybe, Emmy, can we do a couple discussion questions? I'm curious, what's been the most interesting or exciting part of this podcast for you so far?
I think I might have said this the last Mailbag episode, but it has just been so wonderful for the podcast to get received so warmly. People have lovely things to say about the podcast, and that has been extremely helpful for me personally. It can be like a little bit nerve-wracking, sort of it feels like putting pen to paper type situation, especially in a world where things change so quickly and so often. And so it's been really inspiring that folks have been so excited to listen to the podcast. How about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I will say one of my fears with this podcast was that it would turn into complaining about B Lab or something going on in the movement. And I really feel like the guests who have been on and the way that we've had these conversations have made B Lab folks particularly open to the podcast, maybe varying levels of openness depending on who you are and where you sit in B Lab. But yeah, I know that Clay listens to the podcast and other folks in the movement. And so it's just been pretty nice to be able to, provide that constructive, positive feedback loop in the way that we had hoped. So that's exciting for me.
Have there been any surprising insights about listener engagements for you?
Well, definitely I've been excited, surprised about the Japan listeners. Again, Nozomi has done a great job, and the B Market Builder folks in Japan. And so it's been cool to see them in the top couple countries that have listened to the podcast. And yeah, I will say the other interesting thing is there's episodes we've done, like personally, one of my favorite episodes was the one with Kaylee Gibson on the verification process, just because that's such a big part of my life as a consultant helping companies through the certification. And I was a little maybe concerned about, is this too in the weeds for people? But the feedback has been great. People really liked it. And it's personally closed some open loops about what happened for me during that time. And so I feel like it's been that was a therapeutic episode.
Amazing.
Yeah. How has the podcast in your mind, I mean, how has this evolved since its launch for you? Like from what you thought was going to happen to what we're doing now?
I don't know if I realized that it would be like so sort of like listener informed. And it makes sense now that it's like happened and it's happening real time. But I have been really excited to see so many folks, like, one, be so excited about this, but two, give us so many ideas and share so much about what they want to hear. So I think it's pretty in true Lyft economy fashion, like, everything we do is like listener informed.
We do like to listen to people. I think one thing that's evolved for me is I think this originally started out with, let's have some tough conversations that we've been avoiding in the B Corp community, especially with like the Aaron Sahan episode. And for me, like the Kaylee Gibson episode around the verification process, those really were hitting on some of those questions about what are we doing and how do we make the movement better. Now I see the podcast evolving to continue to have those conversations, but it seems like I will say it feels like the community is turning a page from maybe the morass, like sort of stuck. I just had a lot of questions last year and honestly was feeling a little depressed about what had happened with the B Corp community and was trying to figure out how do we get its mojo back. And it feels like, I know structurally B Lab Global is making certain changes that they'll announce at a certain time around how they operate themselves. And with the new standards on the precipice of being released, and it feels like the communities are getting more wind in its sails. And it's like sort of moving past a little bit of that really rough patch. And so I see this podcast evolving from just let's have the tough conversations to now, how do we really, I think it's going to focus a lot on the new standards, especially when the new standards release. We'll be probably doing many episodes on that. And due to EU regulations on B Lab, this podcast may become this is maybe a hot take, is that this podcast may become a way for us to say things that B Lab can't say because they're regulated by EU regulations. So there may be things that we're able to communicate to the community through this podcast that B Lab itself can't say.
That is a hot take.
That's my take.
Should we jump in?
Yeah, let's jump in. Enough about us. So,
everybody's burning questions.
Yeah. Maybe I'll pose this to you, Emmy. So the first is around, we got a great question about just the latest on the new standards. I think if folks are tracking the overall timeline of the standards, we thought it'd be out in 2022 or no, not that early, 2023, 2024, who knows? But then it was 2025 and now it's 2026. And then we thought we'd have the new standards, I think, released by now. We're recording this end of January 2025. And what's the latest for folks who maybe don't know, Emmy, on the standards timeline?
Yeah. It sounds like the new standards have been finalized, and this is like still mostly hearsay, and we haven't seen any like official updates from B Lab since, I don't remember the last time they released an official update, but the rumors are that the standards are finally ready and that they have been circulated internally throughout the B Lab network. And the latest that we've heard is that they'll be released to the public by the end of Q1 this year. And so the end of March, which is very exciting and also cannot come soon enough.
Yeah, because some companies have to certify on the new standards. And so they're probably curious about what they are.
Yeah, and I think for context too, like it might be helpful to know. I mean, when I was at B Lab, and I think still now, B Lab is encouraging folks to start preparing for recertification. And so one could argue similar timeline for initial certification 1 year in advance. And for folks who are due in March 2026, their recertification date, is like math, September 2026, but their submission is due, their impact assessment is due for being updated in March 2026. That's a pretty tight timeline for most companies, let alone some of the larger ones.
Yeah, so we don't know. Clearly, B Lab has good reasons about why the standards aren't out yet. I think they want to get it right, which is probably better than getting it fast because this is such a big change. I imagine there's just a ton of cats you have to herd to like create an effective launch with global partners and B Lab Global. So as Emmy said, standards should be released by end of March, maybe mid-March. I've also heard end of February, they'll be rolling out a new B Corp app, a new login site. And so the BIA is going to look different than what it is. There's a whole product team working on that. And then, so hopefully by the end of February, we'll see a new app. And then end of March, we'll see, a new set of standards.
Yeah. Do you know anyone who has seen the new app? Have you heard anyone talk about it?
No one outside of B Lab people who should see the app. No leaks. No leaks have been reported to me.
Yeah, I only just came across some like obscure article that was like, if you're part of the test user group, and I was like, of course they've been testing it already. We will find out shortly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess just to reiterate for folks, we could use Lyft Economy as an interesting edge case. So our recertification as a B Corp is June, I think 17th, 2026. And so technically that would mean anything before June 30th, you'd be on the current version of the standard, so version 6. And if your recert date is after July 1st, 2026, you'd be on the new standards. This is only for companies, obviously, that are recertifying. And so I was joking with Emmy that we can't do version 6 again. Some companies may be happy that they're on the version 6 again, is what it is. But I think we'll be arguing that we should be on the new standards. I think we have to be, really. If we're going to be talking about this effectively to other people, we need to do it on the new standards.
From the beginning of this, there was talk of folks being able to choose. I would imagine most folks, when given the chance, would choose what they're most familiar with, which makes sense. But folks can opt into the next version of the standards if they want that. And that's hopefully what the Lyft Economy team can do moving forward. So we are pretty excited about it.
Awesome. Since we're talking about timelines, I'll just do a shout out for Champions Retreat 2026. It's going to be April 21 to 23 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's so for exciting. Obviously US and Canada folks, international folks. I don't have, off the top of my head, I don't know when your respective retreats are. But if you want to come on down to Milwaukee,
you're quite welcome.
Yeah. So the second question comes from Josie Sapala from Wise Real Estate Advisors. Shout out to Josie. In the Beehive, I'd posted about the podcast and asked folks if they had any questions. Josie had this really great question that I want to get to. She said that since we're a small business, I would like the podcast to explore the new standards, which we're doing, but in particular, practical steps that small businesses can take to start implementing the changes. And if you have any tips or advice on what companies are doing that have sort of already beginning their journey towards the new standards. So if we could share any experiences, challenges, and how they organize their efforts during this transition. And we thought that was a great question because we are working with some clients on the transition, and we know that some companies are also starting, and there's probably a lot of companies who are wanting thoughts on what do I do? The new standards aren't out yet, but what do I do? Can I get started? So Emmy, what comes up for you around this question?
Yeah, and I will just say too, we talked a little bit earlier about these tight timelines. If your research date, is any sooner than, like, if it's 2026, we're just kind of like already in the thick of things. We're like supposed to be actively working on these things. And so it might feel like a little bit daunting to start working on standards that are not quite finished yet. But from what we have heard from B Lab Global, the current version of the standards, like the draft standards that is currently accessible as of today, the end of January 2025, they are mostly like there. I don't know what the actual percentage is, if it's like 60, 70%.
I think Clay said 95%.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really high.
That was like a year ago.
So many things could have changed. Let's go conservative with 60%, but there will definitely be some like foundational parts of the current version of the draft standards that it's likely B-Lab will be expecting for the next version of the standards. And I feel like at this point, if anything, yeah, they're mostly ready. They're not 100% ready. They're mostly ready. So we do recommend that folks are starting to dig in and figure out where to start. And on that note, where have you started, Ryan?
Yeah, it's a great question. So of the topics in the new standards, there's several that we know are pretty much going to be sticking around. So there's some work you can do with the new standards and how it might apply to your business because we know things aren't changing. So in the final version of the standards, there's going to be 7 sections in the new standards, which I'll mention. So first is purpose and stakeholder governance. Second is fair work, which is a combination of the sort of previous question on workplace culture and fair wages that became fair work.
Yeah.
So then there's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. human rights, climate action, circularity, and environmental stewardship, and then government affairs and collective action. So those are the 7 topics. So if we take the way that I've been approaching it with my clients and the way we've been working on it for a while is that there's several of these sections that you can actually get started on with just the draft standards that have come out in, last year sometime, like spring of 2024. And those sections are the purpose and stakeholder governance section. Most likely, this will stay pretty consistent to how it's going to be. So that's one section folks have started to work on. The next section on fair work, we're actually not working on that section at the moment because fair work and because it was combined between workplace culture and fair wages, it's actually a little bit unclear about what the new standards will be in those sections. And so I've been telling clients we should probably hold off on that because we don't want to do basically what's in the draft standards is not necessarily what's going to be in the final version. So that's the second one. The third one, in justice, equity, diversity, inclusion for JEDI, we do feel like that is pretty much going to be the final. There may be some tweaks. So we've been moving forward on that with clients. The human rights section, similarly. So JEDI, human rights, climate action, environmental stewardship, and circularity. Those 4, we've also been moving forward as if those are not going to be changing materially. And then government affairs and collective action, there's a little bit of uncertainty about that one. That one may change or it may just stay the same. And so if you were a company listening to this and you're like, well, I feel stuck. I feel like I can't move forward because the new standards aren't out and I need to know. I feel like you can move forward on the purpose and stakeholder governance, JEDI, human rights, climate action, and environmental stewardship and circularity. It feels like those 5 are going to be pretty similar. And then I would maybe hold off on fair work and government affairs and collective action, just because I'm not 100% certain what's going to happen with that. What's coming up for you around that? I mean, does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. And actually, I would just moving forward from that, I'm curious if there are any particular ways you go about prioritizing the different requirements and helping your clients to understand, where are you starting?
Yeah. I think we're just starting, honestly, from the top with the purpose and stakeholder governance. And, the nice thing about these draft standards is they're very detailed and they're very thoughtful in what they require. So, for example, one of the requirements is PSG 2 is considering purpose. So PSG, purpose, stakeholder governance. Second question, the company considers impacts on stakeholders and decision making. There's no way that B Lab is changing that. That's like one of their main things is part of their critique of the old standards, the old/current standards, is that it was a checklist. That's not the only critique, but it was more of a static, do you do this or not? And with the new standards, they really want it to be a living relationship with stakeholders. And so, yeah, I've been working with clients on.
It's going from being optional to now required. And it's a lot more dynamic how B Lab is requiring companies to go about reporting it.
Yes. Yeah. And so one thing we've done with some clients, and we actually did an episode on this at Beyond the B on, I think it was episode 3, how to do stakeholder mapping with Tim Frick. We've actually taken some clients through that process because we know that that's coming with the new standards. So that's one, again, that it's pretty straightforward. There's a ton of evidence or data in the sort of draft standards from 2024. For example, it says things like what would be required, what would be the evidence. It says policy or process guide, or other governance documents that outlines the company's stakeholder engagement strategy, or documented evidence of stakeholder considerations. Basically, the draft standards provide a ton of guidance for what you're going to need to do.
Yeah, we've talked about in the past how this current version of the draft standards, is a lot more specific. I really appreciate the opportunity to just jump to the evidence section and just be like, okay, how am I framing this here? How are we building this actual tangible policy or report or initiative? And the evidence section has been really helpful for framing that up. And then the implementation resources are really helpful for sort of getting maybe samples or examples of the ways that other organizations have done this, and maybe some like primary sources, or figuring out like what is, the calculation we should be using for these things. But yes, the new standards are certainly very thorough. And I will also just add that PSG, purpose and stakeholder governance, is a great place to start. And also because it's a lot of like policy and like a lot of paperwork documentation, and just like making sure that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And like Ryan said, it's unlikely to change, but it's also a great place to start simply because it is literally the beginning, which is a lot of how we work with clients at Lyft Economy. We work at the beginning with governance, and it's just like a great way to sort of like keep track of things. Another thing I have sort of recommended to folks in the past is maybe starting with what you feel really confident in. And so if your company is really great in the workers area, in the workers impact topic, if you start there and just start figuring out, you're sort of like truing up what you already have, and maybe some policies, some initiatives that you maybe have partial sort of credit on, and which ones you're missing. Some folks are really great in the environment area, and I would imagine that some companies are really on top of their greenhouse gas emissions, and the climate action topic might be just like a little, like sort of one or two steps further beyond. You're just sort of calculating your emissions going on to make sure that you have the commitment and make sure that it's public and that type of thing. But yeah, I recommended to some folks that they start with what they're really good at, and sort of like building up your confidence in navigating the language, the terminology, the standards microsite, and like getting your bearings for how you're going about organizing this data.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, another strategy we're doing with clients is you can pull out basically the microsite. We pulled it out into a spreadsheet, and really going through one by one, you put in your size, your company, and the industry, and it'll tell you which of the questions in the standards microsite are relevant to you. And so we've pulled those out into spreadsheets, and then just going line by line, like, is this have we met this requirement? Yes, no, maybe. And then like, if it's no or maybe, what do we need to do to meet it? And just going through it sequentially. And so I would say it's pretty similar. Like if you're already familiar with a normal sort of B Corp recertification process, or if you've ever done that before, it's kind of what you do for that too. You create a list. Have we done this? Yes, no, maybe. What's the documentation that could back it up? So I understand the frustration about, I really need to see the final standards to move forward. But I think in my experience and Emmy's experience, there's a ton of stuff you can actually do without even knowing what the new standards are final.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just say +1 to the spreadsheets. At Lyft Economy, we're huge fans of what we call the super sheet. It's a very large spreadsheet with several tabs. And because we work in a cloud system, it's like constantly updating live. And it's a really great way to collaborate with folks across your team or across different other teams. But yes, we are a huge fan of spreadsheets, but I'm curious, Ryan, if there are any other tools. I should also say, like, the magic of spreadsheets is that you can sort of automate some of the things, and there's some ways to like make it look very pretty and exciting and like connect the data in one sheet to another sheet. So we love spreadsheets, and also because they don't usually cost extra. But I'm wondering if there are any other tools and resources that you've come across, Ryan, that you might point folks to, or you've heard other folks using in this process.
Yeah, another great question. Some folks have asked, how do the old standards, or like if I were to compare what I did in the old standards, so the current/old/version 6 standards, and then applied that to the new standards, what would be the difference? And it does seem like the new standards, there's a lot less emphasis on templates and policies and more about practices. And we've actually, I would say, older episodes on this podcast series, for example, episode 3 with Tim Frick on how to do stakeholder mapping. We did episode 9 with David Jaber is about the climate action requirements. We even broke down the B Lab second consultation summary report in episode 10. In episode 12, we talked about circularity as it relates to the standards from both Patagonia and Upcycled Foods. So one tool could be, if you want to make some progress, check out some of the previous episodes on this podcast, because we've really tried to break down what's likely coming. But yeah, I wish I had a sort of easy tool, but I think Emmy's right. At Lyft, there's a lot of pay-to-play options for you can purchase different project management things, et cetera. And we've still found spreadsheets, Google Sheets or Excel to be the most effective and simplest way. So open to it. If other folks, maybe it's a call out to listeners. If you have tools you want to recommend to others to help them with their process, we'd love to hear it. I'm happy to share it with others.
Yeah, I'm constantly looking for, tools that at least people can start with for free. And obviously that varies by company size. But one of my favorite tools I was using with clients was the greenhouse gas emissions calculator by the SME Climate Hub, Small Medium Enterprise Climate Hub. But they're like starting to discontinue that calculator. And it was supposed to be able, like, if you were an organization with up to 500 employees, you were able to use that for free. But I think they're starting to like phase it out, or at least like implement some sort of paywall. I will say that you can do anything with spreadsheets and a really solid file management and organization system. But yeah, there are certainly quite a few tools out there that would make this process a lot easier. And then I'll just also shout out again, in the draft standards on the microsite for each sub-impact topic, there's a section called implementation resources. So that earlier sub-impact topic, the company considers impacts on stakeholders in decision-making. Some of the implementation resources listed are a 5-step approach to stakeholder engagement toolkit and the stakeholder mapping resource from Mighty Bytes, actually, when Tim Frick came on, and general stakeholder governance resources from an organization called the Interdependence Coalition. So there are tools out there, and I think that B Lab has put a lot of time and effort into making sure that folks don't feel alone when they're doing this. But yeah, I would imagine the tools and resources vary quite widely here.
Yeah. I will say the SME Climate Hub, they phased out an older calculator. I think it was Notion. I don't remember. There was some normative. And now they have their own small business free carbon calculator coming in March 2025.
Yay. Okay. That makes me excited.
There's also, so they have 3 tools. So this is a shout out. This is a tool shout out. So they have the small business carbon calculator, which is for like one site businesses. It's a simple online tool. Your business is like 1 to 50 employees. It's free. You can get it at smeclimatehub.org, smeclimatehub.org. also the second tool, which is also at the same website, is an advanced business carbon calculator for multi-site businesses. And it's an auditable spreadsheet, apparently. And it's for any size business. It's also free. And then they have a third tool, which is a Scope 3 specific calculator for supply chain deep dives. It's a powerful online tool that's free and for any size business for Scope 3. So SME Climate Hub, they said, I'll raise you. I'll see your one tool and raise you two more. So they have 3 total tools for free.
That's so exciting because, I mean, and B Lab has, at least US and Canada, has regularly shouted out SME Climate Hub as a great resource for measuring your greenhouse gas emissions and then also committing to your science-based target initiative. But it really is just like such a game changer for businesses to be able to do this for free and at least like understand the amount of time and effort that goes into this. Is so much time and effort. And then on top of that, many businesses have to pay for it. So for these smaller entities, which is the majority of the B Corp movement, places like SME Climate Hub are so important. So thanks, Climate Hub.
Yeah. Emmy, do you see any risk of people just saying, I'm just going to wait until they come out before I do anything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I was at B Lab, and one could argue it's kind of the opposite phenomenon, but like I always said that the first recertification was the hardest because folks didn't quite understand how much of an undertaking recertification is. And then also, like, as much as we've been talking about it for the last several years, there still managed to be quite a few like folks who are just like in a different universe. And they're like, what do you mean? They actually won't find out that there are new standards until they like go into the Impact app and it looks completely different. But I think everyone has their main job. And a lot of times B Corp is on top of their main job. And so it's easy for all these things to fall by the wayside, which I think is another sort of like testament to we're always trying to encourage folks to think about this, like do this process on an annual basis because 3 years really does sneak up on you. And if you get into the habit of it and you're like regularly flexing these muscles, they don't get out of practice. And so, yeah, I would encourage folks, like I would imagine if you looked at the current microsite, the current version of the draft standards, and you see like so much writing, I would not blame you for just exiting out immediately. But maybe just like pick one, do your little drop down demographics. What's your company's size and your industry and your sector? And just like pick one subtopic and like really try to work through it, because once you do one, the next one will be easier and then so on and so forth. But yeah, I think the risk of not doing anything about it until the final draft is available is real, but also like the risk of folks like not thinking about it until maybe a few months before your recert is due is also somewhat likely.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of value in trying to just get started, think about it. Another thing you could do if you're a company that's a little bit uncertain about the steps is start gathering your team together of like, who's your B Corp team? I know there's folks out there who are solo taking it all on themselves. And it's not to say, you have to have multiple people, but I guess even if you are a solo person handling this for your company, who are the key stakeholders that you're going to need to be engaging with? So, finance, HR, leadership, board of directors, facilities, operations. So you could preemptively buy some coffees for people. Hey, how are you doing? Like build some good relationships, knowing that later this year, you'll probably need a lot of information from them. So try to get on folks' good sides now. Bake them cookies.
Yes. I think it's an interesting opportunity to cultivate a culture of or continue to cultivate a culture of learning and innovation where helping folks to understand, like, you might not have all of your data requests like all neatly lined up in a row the first time you come around. Like, it's going to be a collaborative process, and you might have to ask for different data parameters, or you might have to come back and like, oh, this information is helpful, but I actually also need this information on top of that, like helping your team to understand that it's not going to be just like a one-off situation, that you're going to be like collaborators on this. So maybe that's helpful as well.
Well, I think maybe to recap some of the takeaways from today, so new standards, hopefully dropping mid to late March, new B Corp app, potentially end of February. And we definitely recommend getting started even without the new standards dropping. Check out some of the past episodes that we've mentioned from this podcast. Reach out to us. Our day job is helping companies certify and recertify as B Corps and maximize the value. So the team at Lyft Economy, we're here for you. Also, there's a lot of other B consultants. If you're not super pumped on Lyft, check out the B Lab US and Canada has a list of B consultants. They're all amazing people. That's one cool thing about the B consultants world is they're all great people. So whether you work with us or someone else, I think you'll be really happy about working with the B consultant. So
yes,
just a general plug for the community.
Absolutely.
So one other thing I'll mention before we wrap today is a teaser for some next episodes. So we have, depending on when this episode's released, it may already have come out, but if it hasn't yet, the podcast with Chris Turner, who's the head of B Lab UK, where we talk about why is the UK growing off the charts and what can we learn from their initiative and movement. That also featured Deanne Heward-Mills, where we talked about inclusive growth. So that's on the B Lab UK, B Corp UK focused podcast episode that is either out already or will be coming out soon. There's another one coming out with Marcel Fukuyama, and he's from Sistema B in Brazil. And we talk about the history of the movement, or sort of what's been going on in Brazil and some of the challenges of the global governance structure, which we get into a little bit in that episode. There's another episode coming up about the growth of the B Corp movement in Asia. So we're going to be speaking with Nozomi from Japan and Cecilia from Singapore and Sally from B Lab China, and learning about the growth of the B Corp movement in Asia. We're also going to be potentially getting into a conversation on the different perspectives around, is the B Corp movement woke or not? And the anti-ESG, anti-DEI sentiment that's been at least strongly in the US and in some other places. And what are all the perspectives around, is the B Corp movement too left-leaning or too woke, or how do we sort of include everyone in the conversation? And so that's a TBD early stage podcast that we'll be discussing in the near future. And then there will be a lot of standards related podcast episodes. People maybe there'll be at least 7 for each topic of the new standards. Will have its own episode, probably more. Any other thoughts, Emmy?
I hope you're not tired hearing us talk about the standards, because we will be talking about it a lot more.
So much. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We really encourage you, keep sending in your episode suggestions, and we love hearing from you, and we'll definitely try to integrate things into our upcoming Mailbag episodes or standalone episodes. So thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Bee. We are trying to grow our audience and wanted to ask you a huge favor that you can do right now. Try to think of one person that might like this show. Then pull out your phone and text them something like, "Hey, I think you might like this new podcast, Beyond the Bee. Check it out at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Seriously, try to text someone right now. Pull out your phone. Then follow up with them to see how they liked it. This would be super helpful for us. We deeply appreciate your support.